In the spring of 1968, inside a private gym in West Los Angeles, a man weighing 220 pounds was taken apart in 6 seconds. Not knocked out. Not submitted. Taken apart. The man was a professional bodyguard, trained in military combatives, employed to protect one of Hollywood's biggest stars. The person who dismantled him weighed 135 pounds and moved with a precision that made the witnesses go silent. This is that story. Steve McQueen wasn't just famous. He was untouchable. The king of cool. A box office giant who did his own stunts, rode his own motorcycles, and trusted almost no one. In an industry built on illusion, McQueen demanded reality. He surrounded himself with people who could handle themselves. People who knew violence. People who had seen war. His personal security wasn't hired for appearance. It was hired for capability. And in 1968, that capability had a name. Dale Johnson. 6'2". Former Marine. A man whose job was to stand between Steve McQueen and anything that threatened him. Johnson wasn't an actor pretending to be tough. He was the kind of man who cleared rooms before McQueen entered them. The kind who had broken bones and been paid for it. He carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone who had never lost a fight that mattered. But there was a problem growing in Hollywood. A shift. A new kind of presence that didn't fit the old rules. Bruce Lee had arrived. Not as a novelty. Not as a stunt coordinator hiding in the background. He was teaching. And the people he was teaching were some of the most powerful men in the world. McQueen had heard the rumors. Everyone had. A Chinese martial artist who moved differently. Who claimed things that sounded impossible. Who spoke about speed and economy of motion like a physicist discussing time. McQueen was curious. But he was also skeptical. He had grown up fighting. He understood what real violence looked like. And he had seen enough Hollywood mysticism to recognize a performance when he saw one. So when the opportunity came to visit Bruce Lee's school in Chinatown, McQueen didn't go alone. He brought Dale Johnson. Not as a test. Not openly. But as insurance. As a measuring stick. As someone who would know if what they were seeing was real. The school wasn't glamorous. It was a second-floor space above a restaurant, accessible only by a narrow staircase that smelled like ginger and frying oil. The training area was small. Hardwood floors. Mirrors on one wall. Heavy bags hanging in the corner. No air conditioning. The heat collected and stayed. Bruce Lee was in the center of the room when they arrived, working with a student on footwork. He was smaller than McQueen expected. Compact. His movements were efficient in a way that seemed almost mechanical. Lee stopped when they entered. He didn't smile the way most instructors did when famous clients arrived. He nodded. Acknowledged them. Then returned to his student. McQueen respected that. Johnson watched in silence. For the first 20 minutes, they observed. Lee demonstrated techniques. Spoke about angles. About interception. About closing distance before the opponent realized distance had changed. His voice was calm. Analytical. There was no showmanship. No dramatic flourishes. Just information delivered with the precision of someone who had tested every word in real conditions. Then Lee did something unexpected. He invited questions. Not about philosophy. Not about movies. About application. About whether what he taught could work against someone larger, stronger, trained in Western methods. McQueen glanced at Johnson. Johnson stepped forward. Not aggressively. But deliberately. He wasn't challenging Lee. He was asking a question with his body. Asking if the small man in the black pants and fitted shirt could do against him what he claimed could be done. Lee looked at Johnson for 3 full seconds. Not sizing him up the way fighters do before a match. He was reading. Calculating. Then he asked a simple question. He asked if Johnson had ever been hit by someone his size. Johnson smiled. Said no. Said it honestly. There was no arrogance in it. Just fact. Lee nodded. Then he asked if Johnson would like to understand what that felt like. The room went still. McQueen leaned against the wall. He didn't interfere. This was the moment he had brought Johnson for. To see what happened when theory met bone. They moved to the center of the room. Lee gave Johnson instructions. Stand naturally. Don't anticipate. React as you would on the street. Johnson settled into a loose stance. Hands at his sides. Weight balanced. He wasn't tense. He was ready the way a professional is ready. Lee stood 7 feet away. Arms relaxed. Breathing normal. He didn't announce what he was going to do. He didn't count down. He just moved. What happened next didn't look like a fight. It looked like a physics demonstration. Lee closed the distance in 1 step. Not a leap. Not a lunge. A single, measured step that erased 7 feet as if space had folded. His lead hand came forward in a straight line. It wasn't a punch the way Johnson understood punches. There was no wind-up. No shoulder rotation telegraphing intent. The hand simply appeared in front of Johnson's chest. And then it made contact. Johnson left the ground. Not dramatically. Not theatrically. He lifted. His feet separated from the floor by 8 inches. His body traveled backward across the hardwood for 12 feet before his shoulders hit the mat Lee had positioned behind him. The sound was a single, flat thud. Johnson didn't shout. Didn't gasp. He just laid there. Eyes open. Breathing shallow. Trying to understand what had happened to his nervous system. The witnesses said the entire sequence took 6 seconds. From Lee's first step to Johnson lying on the mat. 6 seconds. But what disturbed them wasn't the speed. It was the control. Lee hadn't hurt Johnson. Not really. There was no malice in the strike. No emotion. It was a demonstration. A proof. Johnson had been moved like an object in an equation. And the room understood that Lee had chosen how hard to hit. That he could have calibrated it differently. That the restraint was the most frightening part. McQueen didn't move from the wall. He watched Johnson stand up. Watched him test his ribs. Roll his shoulders. Johnson looked at Lee and asked what the technique was called. Lee said it was a 1-inch punch extended across distance. Johnson nodded slowly. Then he asked if Lee could do it again. Lee said no. Said once was enough. Said the body remembers. Johnson agreed. He didn't challenge again. He didn't need to. The question had been answered. Later accounts from people in the room described the silence afterward. No one spoke for almost a minute. Not because they were shocked. Because they were processing. McQueen had seen men knocked out before. He had seen fights end badly. But this was different. This wasn't about dominance. It was about understanding. Lee had shown them something that existed outside the framework they used to measure combat. And it was that precision, that calibration, that stayed with them. McQueen became one of Bruce Lee's most dedicated students. Not because he wanted to learn tricks. Because he wanted to understand the system. The logic. The geometry. He trained privately with Lee for months. Brought him into his home. Paid him rates far above what other instructors charged. And he never spoke publicly about what happened that day with Dale Johnson. Neither did Johnson. It remained private. A story shared only among the people who were there. But stories like that don't stay buried. Martial artists who trained at Lee's school heard pieces of it. Stunt coordinators who worked with McQueen noticed the change in how he moved. The details shifted depending on who told the story. Some said Johnson was knocked unconscious. Others said he refused to return to the school. But the people who were actually there remembered something quieter. They remembered a man who got up, who shook Lee's hand, who admitted that what he thought he understood about fighting had a gap in it. Bruce Lee died 5 years later. The circumstances were disputed. The theories multiplied. But the people he had touched, the students he had trained, carried forward something that couldn't be disputed. A methodology. A way of seeing combat that treated it like an engineering problem. McQueen spoke about Lee in interviews after his death. He called him one of the most intelligent men he had ever met. He didn't call him the toughest. He didn't call him the fastest. He called him intelligent. And for someone like McQueen, who valued realness above all else, that word meant more than any superlative. Dale Johnson left personal security work in the early 70s. He opened a gym in Northern California. Taught self-defense to civilians. He rarely spoke about his time protecting McQueen. But people who trained with him noticed something. He incorporated techniques that didn't come from military combatives. Footwork that prioritized economy. Entries that focused on closing distance before the opponent's brain could register threat. When asked where he learned them, he would say he picked them up in Los Angeles. He never mentioned Bruce Lee by name. But the students who knew, knew. The footage people imagined from that day doesn't exist. No cameras were present. No one recorded it. The only evidence is memory. And memory is fragile. It bends under the weight of time. Details sharpen or fade depending on who needs the story to mean something. But the core of it remains. A man trained to protect one of the most famous actors in the world stepped into a room with a martial artist who weighed less than most welterweights. And in 6 seconds, the framework shifted. What makes the story significant isn't the violence. Violence was common in that world. Stuntmen broke bones on set. Fighters competed in unsanctioned matches. The Los Angeles underground had no shortage of men testing themselves. What makes it significant is the witnesses. McQueen wasn't easily impressed. Johnson wasn't naive. The other people in that room had seen real altercations. They had trained. They had perspective. And what they saw that day didn't fit the models they carried. Bruce Lee's legacy is complicated now. He has been mythologized beyond recognition. Every story about him has been inflated or doubted. The truth sits somewhere in the middle. He was a human being. He had limits. He lost sparring matches. He injured himself training. He struggled with the same insecurities everyone struggles with. But within those limits, he had discovered something. A way of moving that compressed time. A way of striking that transferred force with minimal effort. And the people who felt it, who experienced it directly, carried that knowledge forward even when they couldn't explain it. The gym above the restaurant in Chinatown closed years ago. The building was renovated. Turned into office space. There's no plaque. No marker indicating what happened there. The hardwood floors were pulled up. The mirrors removed. But the people who trained there, who stood in that heat and learned to move differently, they remember. Some of them are still alive. Still teaching. Still trying to pass on something that can't be fully captured in words. McQueen died in 1980. Cancer. He was 50. By then, he had stepped away from Hollywood. Lived quietly. Spent his final years away from cameras. In interviews toward the end, when asked about regrets, he said he wished he had trained longer with Bruce Lee. Wished he had understood sooner. He didn't elaborate. Didn't need to. The people who knew what he meant didn't need elaboration. There's a tendency now to dismiss stories like this. To call them exaggerations. To say that 6 seconds isn't enough time for anything meaningful. And maybe that's true. Maybe the witnesses misremembered. Maybe the story grew in the telling. But something happened in that room. Something that changed how Steve McQueen saw combat. Something that made Dale Johnson reconsider his assumptions. Something that left a mark not in footage or records, but in the bodies and minds of the people present. Bruce Lee spoke often about the difference between knowing and understanding. He said most people know techniques. They can recite them, demonstrate them on compliant partners. But understanding requires contact, requires resistance, requires the moment when theory meets another human being who doesn't want to be moved. And in that moment, everything you thought you knew gets tested. For Dale Johnson, that test lasted 6 seconds. And it was enough. The story doesn't end with a lesson. It doesn't wrap up neatly. Dale Johnson lived another 40 years. He trained hundreds of people. He never became famous. Bruce Lee became a legend. Steve McQueen became an icon. The three of them intersected for one afternoon in a second-floor gym that smelled like cooking oil and sweat. And what passed between them stayed private. Not because it was secret. Because it was personal. Because some things can only be understood by the people who were there. According to those who remained in contact with Johnson before he passed, he kept a single photograph from his years with McQueen. It wasn't an action shot. It wasn't McQueen on a motorcycle or holding a gun. It was a candid picture from inside Lee's school. Johnson standing in the background. McQueen in the center. Bruce Lee demonstrating something with his hands. No one is looking at the camera. They're all focused on Lee's hands. And if you look closely, you can see it. The attention. The respect. The understanding that they were witnessing something rare. That photograph is in a private collection now. It's never been published. The family doesn't loan it out. But people who have seen it say the same thing. They say you can feel the heat of that room. You can sense the tension. Not the tension of conflict. The tension of learning. Of realizing that what you thought was solid might be softer than you believed. And that maybe, just maybe, the small man in the center of the frame understood something the rest of the world was still trying to figure out. 6 seconds. That's all it took. Not to win a fight. Not to prove dominance. But to shift understanding. To make a professional protector reconsider his framework. To make a Hollywood king into a student. That's what happened above a restaurant in Chinatown in 1968. And the people who were there never forgot it.